Thank you for coming to listen to this presentation. The title of the presentation is The Restoration of African Greatness. And that would imply that Africa has had a period of greatness in the past, and that somehow this greatness has been lost over the period, and that there's something that we have to restore. The common view, at least in the 20th and 19th and 20th century, that Africa was a dark continent, basically uncivilized savages, until the white people so graciously came to save them and take care of their brothers and make them civilized and so on, which is actually the opposite of the truth. Africa had a very great civilization until the Europeans, who came and basically destroyed all the civilization that existed in Africa. And we will go into that a little bit in detail. But part of this, why we don't know much about this.
Govinda?
Yes.
Excuse me, but you're going to have to go a little slower. Maybe
Okay.
pause a little bit after
there's
each
translation.
sentence.
Okay.
Yes, and they're not, we're doing our best we can with volunteers who are working really hard. Thank you.
Yeah. So the reason that we do not know, some people know, of course, and here maybe there are those who are great students of African history, but people in general are not aware of the African history, because it was on purpose done like this. Even many famous historians seems to have lost out on Africa. For example, Hugh Trevor Ropers, who is the Regius Professor of History at Oxford University, he wrote in his book, The Rise of Christian Europe, he wrote, undergraduates, seduced as always by the changing breadth of journalistic fashion, demand that they should be taught the history of Black Africa. Perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach. But at the present, there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not the subject for history. Obviously, Professor Trevor Ropers got this very wrong. He got it almost as wrong as when he, some few decades ago, pronounced that the infamous Hitler diaries were authentic and written by Hitler, and he had a lot of egg in his face for that. And he was equally wrong when it comes to Africa.
Excuse me, Govinda, you're still showing the title slide, correct?
Yeah. I'm starting now. This is present. It will start to go now. This is just the introduction. Now let us then go and okay. Let us now start to look at a little back. We will start this presentation by looking at some of the civilization that existed in Africa before the Europeans came. And Africa does not only have a glorious history, it also have the most exciting and most meaningful prehistory of any continent on the planet, simply because it was in Africa that humanity arose. Before the human beings came, we had like pre-humans, like the Australopithecine hominid species, which first appeared around 4 million years ago. The oldest fossil that exists of these were Lucy, which was dated at 3.2 million years ago, and that was found in Africa. Now, also the oldest remnants of actual human beings, Homo sapiens, were discovered in Africa, and they are dating 315,000 years ago. So for for hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived in one place and one place only, and that was Africa. Around 50 to 60,000 years ago, humans started to migrate out of Africa and came to Europe and Asia, and so eventually we had humanity spread all over the planet. These are fairly uncontroversial when it comes to most archaeologists and those who studied prehistory. So Africa is of very great importance to the origin of the human species. Around 10,000 to 8,000 BC, that means 10 to 12,000 years ago, humanity in Africa started to become, became farmers. They cultivated wheat and barley. And as early as 4,000 BC, that is 6,000 years ago, they learned the tricks of smelting metals, copper, and other metals, and started to create tools and things with this. Now, this was the turning point from where we could say that prehistory ended, and that's where the history of Africa proper has taken place. So the history of Africa, which is the earliest documented, are in two places. It is Ethiopia and Egypt. Now, we have much more information about the Egypt, so we will concentrate on that, but Ethiopia is also very interesting. Egypt, about 4,500 BC, that's 6,500 years old, started, this is the pre-dynastic period. They were building houses of mud, and the civilization was still pretty primitive. By 3,600 BC, in the dynastic area, they had learned how to make stone buildings that were usually done in square, normal shapes like we have today. They did not use mortar, but they were very careful and knew how to put stones together so they were stable. They used boats for travel. The agriculture was very developed. And a few hundred years later, we see the rise of the Old Kingdom, about 3,200 BC. That was the time where hold on one second. Should have started the timer, so I'm not sure I'm keeping to the format. Okay, so around 3,200 BC, the pyramids were built, and the science and the literature and so flourished. It was a very productive time in the history of Egypt. Science, math, astronomy, medicine, and many other important things were developed well before, long thousands of years before the Greek. And there are Greek texts who confirm this. That is, I have it. Herodotus, for example, he ascribed the origin of geometry to Egyptians, and there were many who confirmed that their knowledge from the Greek actually came originally from Africa, from Egypt, where they came and studied. And it's a very interesting thing that Herodotus also claimed that Egyptians were the first persons to circumnavigate Africa. Otherwise, we think it's, we've been told that it's Vasco da Gama who did this. But I will read a little quote from Herodotus, who wrote, and you know, he was he was a Greek philosopher, and he lived a few hundred years before our common era. And he wrote, "Africa is evidently surrounded by water, apart from its junction with Asia. The Egyptian ruler Necho II was the first to prove this, as far as we know. After he had abandoned the construction of the canal from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, an undertaking completed by King Darius a century later, he dispatched Phoenicians in ships with the instruction to sail back to Egypt by the way of the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. They sailed southward from the Erythraean Sea, and when autumn came, they disembarked on whatever coast of Africa they happened to have reached, sowed their seeds, and awaited harvest. Then they reaped the corn and put this to sea again. In the third year, they rounded the Pillars of Hercules and reached Egypt with a report, which may be credible to some but not to me, that as they sailed around Africa, they had the sun to the right." Now, this is very interesting, because if you're traveling westward on the northern hemisphere, then you have the sun to the left. And the Greek did not know at that time that if you went south enough and were south of the equator, if you traveled westward, then you would have the sun on your right. So it gives credence to that, to the claim that actually Egyptians by that time they had able to travel around Africa 1,000 years before Vasco da Gama did.
Excuse me, Govinda. Phoenish and Buduvati are both in the interpretation rooms now. If they can unmute themselves, they can interpret for French and for Portuguese. Buduvati, you're still muted. Okay, Govinda, you can continue. Thank you.
The history of Egypt is not so controversial, and even Western historians believed it. But there's a twist. They say that Egyptians are not Africans. They were basically white people who somehow ended up in Africa. And because you could not believe that Black Africans could be responsible for such a great civilization, and that which predated the Greek and the Roman, and is the mother of all our science. And that was, but even as early as when the Napoleon's archaeologists entered Egypt, they realized that the ancient Egyptians were actually Black, and that okay, I will quote something from Dr. Stanley Sankange, who is a Zimbabwean professor of history who was teaching in the US. But what race were the ancient Egyptians? Negro, of course. Even though there were Caucasians in Egypt at this time, there is nothing to suggest they were more numerous than or drove away the native Black population we found in the country. On the contrary, all the evidence point to the to the black population having remained dominant. This was not only the opinion of Napoleon's scientists, it was also the view of contemporaries like Diodorus, Strabo, Pliny, Tacitus, and Herodotus, who visited the country. The Boyce also concludes that the Egyptians were Negroid, and not only that, but by tradition they believed themselves descended from not from the white or the yellow races, but from the black people of the south. Now, why was it so hard for Westerners to accept that the Egyptian civilization came from Africa and it was black? It was because the slave trade was very prominent at those days, and the way you justified slavery was that black people are actually not human. They are a different species, they are subhuman, and therefore, even if you're supposed to give equal rights to everybody, it doesn't count to Africans because they are so inferior that even making them slaves makes them elevates them rather than let them be in their own savagery. This was how the discussions went. So therefore, to then show that all our knowledge and civilization came from Africa was too much, and because that would challenge the whole legitimacy of the slave trade. And this myth has been perpetrated up to the end of the 20th century, where you have white modern ladies playing Cleopatra in the movies and so on. So the idea that Africa, it has changed a little bit. Now in the 21st century, we've actually had actresses that are black Cleopatra because it's becoming more accepted. But the prejudice against accepting that Egyptians were actually black Africans has been very difficult to get away from. No, but it was not only in Egypt that there was a great civilization. There was in many, many places. We will just take a few. I mean, this is not it would be a one-year course in African history if we should go into a lot of it. But let's take a little bit from here and there. So now let's go to West Africa, the Ghana Empire. And the see my notes here. The Ghana Empire existed. There are different ideas of both how big it was and the time it existed. A conservative estimate that it lasted from the 6th century to the 13th century, but some say it lasted for 1,000 years, and some even claim that it lasted longer than that. What is clear is that it was very rich, and it traded in copper, gold, iron, and other things, and with Spain and Portugal. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the founder or the first president of present-day Ghana, he was the one he invented the name Ghana for what was then the Gold Coast. And he writes in I Speak of Freedom, he writes like this: for the thousands of years that the Ghana Empire existed, it spread over the wide expanse of territory in the Western Sudan. Its influence far across the Sudan, from Lake Chad in the east to the Futajalan Mountains in the west, and from the southern fringes of the Sahara Desert in the north to the bights of Benin and Biafra in the south. Thus, the Ghana Empire was known to have covered what is now the greatest part of West Africa, namely from Nigeria in the east to Senegambia in the west. While it existed, the Ghana Empire carried on extensive commercial relationships with the outside world, extending so far as Spain and Portugal. Gold, animal skin, ivory, cola nuts, gums, honey, corn, and cotton were among the articles that writers most frequently named. It is reported that Egyptians, Europeans, and Asiatic students attended the great and famous university and other institutes of learning that flourished in Ghana during the medieval period to learn philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and law. It had a strong rulers, strong kings that took for all this trade. They charged custom duties, and through the custom duties, they financed an army of 200,000 soldiers. There was a centralized administration. The capital in Kombosale were covered almost 50 hectares of land, and they had a judicial system, good communications, and so on. So these were not, and this preceded European that it came. So it was actually after the Europeans came and imposed themselves in Africa that empires like Ghana Empire started to crumble and disappear. Let's jump to the south of Africa, Kingdom of Zimbabwe. It was also founded in the 12th century, and it was abounded about 15th century, and then it was replaced by the Roswe Empire. It was also very wealthy in trade, and had trading wings as far as China and Persia. What we see mostly today is the ruins of their amazing stonework. It may not be as impressive as Egyptian pyramids, but it still was so impressive that the white settlers when Cecil Rhodes came to Zimbabwe, the white people came. They believed that there must have been a white race who had come and built all these structures, and then later on disappeared, and nobody where they were. They were a big mystery, because again, nobody could
believe. Please slow down a bit.
Yeah,
Guruvati, you're still muted, so no translation for French. Thank you. Go ahead.
So it is this prejudice that Africans were not able to do anything great or so, because they had already claimed that they were all savages, and they tried to remove from the truth that Africa had a great civilization with seats of learning and were pretty advanced long before civilization developed in Europe. Now, we cannot go through all of them in details. Let's just go very quickly a few. You have the Kanem, just to show that there were many of them Kanem Borno. This existed from about 700 up to 1893 in the present-day Chad. And why it was ended in 1893 was because of European invasion during the scramble for Africa, which we'll return to later on. The Hausa states from the 9th to 18th century, they are northern Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, northern Ghana, and like that. You have a Mani Congo, which is now where it used to be Zaire or Congo, Republic of Congo, from the 14th to the 19th century. And there's a lot of travelers from Europe who came during the 15th, 16th, 17th century who wrote about the huge cities, the magnificent organizations, and so there are external documents that prove all these things. You have the Benin, which actually has nothing to do with the Republic of Benin today. This was a Yoruba kingdom that was in the center of Nigeria. Especially their bronzes are very famous, and their terracotta sculptures. The Ashanti was the last empire standing. It was founded by Osei Tutu in 1670, and where he united a lot of Akan clans who had existed there for almost 1,000 years earlier. But with his high priest Konfu Anoche, they founded the Ashanti, and their headquarters in Kumasi, in the present in Ghana. They traded in the beginning with the Portuguese when they started knocking on the doors, and they fought 5 wars with the British, and most of these wars were lost by the British, but it's the final battle that matters. And the final war was in 1900, where Ashanti lost, and the British were tired of having to fight, so they burnt down the capital, and they took all the leaders and exiled them from the country. Now, but then the question is, in all other countries where you've had a great history and a lot of powerful kingdoms and so, they don't just vanish and disappear in history, like totally forgotten, and there's no trace of them. So what was it that broke down and destroyed Africa? Well, it was the slave trade. This is an interesting, just for understand the suffering of it. This is an illustration of how slaves in a British slave ship were stored. This one carried 200, almost 300 slaves, and they were basically packed like sardines, and their head space were maybe 30, just a couple of feet, so they could not sit up. They were lying throughout the whole trip over the Atlantic. Now, the conditions were so bad, so usually 1/3 of all the slaves died, or sometimes half of them, but it didn't matter because the trade was so enormously profitable. So even if half of them died, it didn't make any difference to the slavers. But how did the slave trade start? How come they came to the idea of taking slaves from Africa? Okay, that's also an interesting story. Europeans, as soon as they discovered that there were countries outside Europe, they considered them and treated them as they were their own territories to plunder and use at their own discretion. There was no mutual respect at all. They basically just grabbed and stole and destroyed wherever they put their hand. And that's how they became richer. Take, for example, in the Americas, the history of how they destroyed the Native American population. If anyone is interested, you should read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Actually, it's the only book I've ever started to read, which I was interested in, which I couldn't finish because it was just too depressing and too gruesome of all the horrendous acts that the Europeans did, and the destruction of all the African civilizations. But in the beginning, they just stole gold, like the Incas, the Aztecs, and they robbed natural resources and so on, enslave people, and they exterminate them. But they discovered then something that was very valuable. That was sugar. And sugar became Europe became addicted to sugar, and it became one of the world's most valuable commodities. The problem with that sugar required a lot of cheap or even preferable free labor for it to work. And where would they get the labor to do this? The first logical thing was to take the Native Americans, but it turned out they were not very useful as slaves because they had the audacity to die when you put them to work. They got very easily sick because they did not have the estimate the storage of just one second.
Immunity. They didn't have the immunity.
Sorry, that was some noise. Okay. They didn't have the immune system to cope with even the simplest of European diseases, and that killed probably as many. Sickness killed probably as many as were killed in battle and so. Now, at one time, a group of Africans were captured in a raid, more for curiosity's sake than anything else. And once they got tired of looking at them, they sent them to the New World and to work. And they found out that they were totally resistant to any disease that the white man had, because especially in West Africa, there are a lot of diseases. So the immune system of Africans was very, very good. Actually, it was the reverse. It was the white people who came to West Africa and Africa who died of the sicknesses there. West Africa was called white man's grave, at least until the time they discovered quinine, because they were all dying particularly in malaria. Okay, anyway, so they found out that Black people were much better equipped to survive when they're dealing with the with the Europeans, and they were also used to tropical climate and working hard. So therefore, they became the perfect Africans. Turned out to be the perfect slaves in the whole world. You couldn't find better slaves than Africans, and therefore they became in great demand. How did then the slave trade, how did they get the slaves? There were many. You could have direct raids where in the beginning were direct raids, and Europeans just went into places and stole slaves, but you couldn't get enough quantities that they wanted. So instead they invented that they started to talk with different tribes, and they created animosity between them and gave them weapons and encouraged both of them to fight and pretending they were behind them. But then in the final take, then they start to support one more than the others to make sure that it would win. And the condition was that the tribe they won over, they would then be captured and be given as slaves to the Europeans. Later on, once this was established, they did not need to go into this thing about the rivalry. The tribes were already established, so all they did was have to barter for slaves. Mainly the commodity was guns, rum, and glass beads. You can actually still find some of those in antiquity stores. They're called the trade beads these days, and they were very attractive. So they were selling these ones for slaves, and then the Africans had now got used to fighting each other and making raids and going for weaker places in order to get the slaves and sold to the white people. This caused now great instability and the collapse of the whole African society. The instigations and the probing by the Europeans destroyed all the big kingdoms, and unless they were supportive and settled in the same order and started to cooperate with the Europeans and selling slaves, because that was the only thing that Europeans were interested in at this day. Over a period of 500 years, an estimated 200 million Africans were taken as slaves. Well, this is the higher level. There are others who claim that it was less, but there's no one who claims that it was at least in 20-30 millions, but the estimate goes as much as 200 million slaves. And this was the end, or the beginning of the end of the African nations. Let's take an example of how this could be. John Hawkins. John Hawkins, he made 3 trips to West Africa and stole slaves, took them to to America, sold them. And he made so much money on these 3 trips that Queen Elizabeth I became interested and wanted to support him and wanted to be a part owner in the operation. And as an investment, he provided him with a ship, which had the name Jesus. And with Jesus, he went and stole so many more Africans, and the profits were so great that the Queen decided to make him a knight. And as his coat of armor, he depicted the representation of an African in chains. And this was 1516. It was to the 19th century. The slave trade operated continued to operate. What happened was it was basically something we call the triangular trade. You took and stole or bought slaves from Africa and took them to America to work on the sugar plantation. Then the sugar that had been produced were taken and sold in Europe, and then in Europe, from the profits, they exported guns, glass beads, and rum to Africa in exchange for more slaves. Now, each of these stages were extremely profitable. And where did all these profits go? It went into finance the Industrial Revolution. You know, even if you want to now make one factory, you need a lot of money. Nowadays, we create money from nothing by the banking system, but in those days, nobody had figured out that wizardry. So in order to get the finance to do something, you needed actually like real cash. And this was the cash machine that made the Industrial Revolution in Europe possible. But after the Industrial Revolution had become strong and established, then the need for slaves dropped. Slaves, not because of humanitarian reasons, so that people thought, no, there were a lot of priests and so on argued that slavery was inhumane and this and that. Black people are also people, but that's not why it was stopped. It was stopped for the simple reason that it was no longer profitable. And the reason it was not profitable is that in an industrial state, in a capitalist society, slaves are expensive burden, and it's not really an asset. You have to feed them, you have to buy them, you have to take care of them, and because they are now your investments, you have to actually make sure they survive and live. In a but a capitalist producer don't need slaves because the production is done by large machines. So what they need raw materials and markets for the consumer goods. They also need cheap labor, but it's much better to force people into destitution so they would work in the factories for very little wages. Because here you could actually pay them less than what you give to the slaves, because you don't invest any money in them. They come freely to your work, and if they starve to death or they get sick or hurt, you just throw them away and get other workers. So, and another very important thing is slaves have no money, so they cannot buy anything. And a capitalist production needs consumers. And anything you would give to a factory worker, you know you're going to get it back, because they are forced to buy consumer goods, food, and other things that are being produced in the factory, so it recycles it. So the bottom line is that the slave trade stopped because there was no need for slaves, and rather it was a burden and a cost on slavery. And we entered the next area, which is the area of colonialism. But why did we have colonialism? It was never intended to start colonies, because what was expected originally is that, am I still too fast, or are you keeping up with the translations? What is needed was, yeah. So what was needed, what Europe needed from Africa was raw materials and markets, and markets for the goods. And it was expected that now, when slave trades ended, they thought that Africans would then come and run and start to work and grow palm oil, which was very, very important industrial raw material, and work in the mines, and then sell this to Europe, and keep on buying silly things. Like in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what really got it started was the textile industry. But the problem was that Africa, India, China, everywhere they were making textiles that were much higher quality than the one that produced in Europe. So nobody was really interested in it. In the Kente cloth in Ghana was far, far superior to anything that was manufactured in Europe. So the problem that the assumptions were wrong. Africans were not interested to work for the capitalists in Europe and to buy their products. So how do you solve it? It needed a big decision and something seriously to be done about it. And the solution came in the form of imposing colonial rule. It means you took over and run all the countries, and then decided just what people should do, like a dictatorship, an extreme type of dictatorship. The way this started was with this. This started when the decision was taken. It started the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference 1884, the Europeans countries, they divided up Africa between themselves. Well, actually, that's not true. But that was the effect of it. What they actually decided was a simple thing. They said that European armies in Africa will never fight each other. It means that whenever two armies, European armies, meet each other in Africa, they just draw the boundary wherever the armies meet, and so avoiding a war. But that meant basically that whoever got there first, they got the territory without a fight. So during the 20 years from 1880 to 1900, the whole of Africa was colonialized, a very short period. In 1880, there were only two places in Africa that were governed by white people, and that was the Gold Coast and the Cape Province in South Africa. Now, by 1900, all of Africa, except Liberia and Ethiopia, were colonialized and ruled by Africans, by Europeans, and it is exception for Liberia and Ethiopia. Here, what I wrote there, obviously I got the language wrong, all right? But what I mean to say is that Liberia and Ethiopia were independent, and Liberia was actually a place that America had set for relief for freed African slaves. So the only indigenous rules left in Africa was Ethiopia in the whole continent. If you look at this map, the different colors depends on who the ruling thing is. The yellow here is Belgian Congo. The blue is the French. The red is British, and so on. You have Germans, you have Portugal, you have Spain, and even Italian had a little bit here up in the portion of the of Africa. So, what then did this colonialization accomplish? Well, it's the two things again. They needed Africa to export cheap raw materials and to import expensive goods. That was the purpose of it. And how did they accomplish it? Well, they imposed a dictatorship that made sure that it was only European businessmen had exclusive right to do whatever they want in Africa, to do business there. They made sure there was no trade or interaction between African nations. Everything was from the colony to the motherland. They made sure that no industries would be allowed to produce anything in Africa that could compete with European businesses. They were basically only supposed to supply the raw materials that the European businesses was needed, and they needed to make sure that people buy goods. In the beginning, as I say, it was textile. How did they get people to buy inferior quality European suits and trousers like that? By making it compulsory for people who worked in the administration or the only place. Okay, they did it like that. They imposed head taxes on people. It means everybody has to pay tax just because they exist. But the only way to get the money to pay the taxes was to work for the white people in their administration and in their farms. And then so people were forced to go and work for white people in order to get money to pay the head tax. Then they also then imposed that in order to work in a ministry, for example, you need to wear European clothes. So then you created a demand for European textiles and exports. At the same time, there was a religious exploitation. There was imposition of the religious beliefs of Europeans. They suppressed local languages, which were the vernaculars that should be discouraged, and everybody should speak the colonializing powers country language. And the psychic exploitation, which this was, of course, part of, but the other was the narrative that Africa is a dark continent, uncivilized. There were no civilization here until white people came and so gracefully took care of their small African brothers and made them civilized. It's like Rudyard Kipling talking about the white man's burden, where white people, out of their goodness of their heart, goes out and helps and civilizes the rest of the world. But the truth is the opposite. I think Europeans were the most uncivilized people that ever existed because their extreme greed and their disregard for other people's cultures. And they destroyed Africa and destroyed the culture. And then they come and claim that there's never been one, there has never been a history, and that the history starts with white men in Africa. But everything comes to an end, and even so, the colonial area. Now, the colonial area, there's problems with colonialization. Yes, it served its purposes, but of making African countries suppliers of cheap raw materials, imported expensive manufacturing, that was completely successful. But once the economy has been set up such, the direct rule was also costly. You have to pay for a civil administration, and also then you had a moral responsibility. You had to, just like in the slave trade, you had to take care of the people that you're saying that are your subjects and which is paying taxes to you. And this became quite inconvenient. So the idea was then, and many Africans now, in order to be better servants, they were sent to educated in European universities. They learned the ideas about democracy and freedom. And so there were a lot of agitation for independence. And after considering the pros and cons, it was decided then that the best thing was to give them the independence, because African countries were already stuck as suppliers of raw materials and markets for goods. And the colonial administration was no longer needed. It was just costly and expensive. And the brilliant thing was just to give all these people who were looking for independence, give them their independence and maintain, instead of political control, you maintain economic control. And that's how neo-colonialism entered into the picture. And so they could basically get what they needed from Africa without having to spend and directly be involved in administrating it. So even after the colonialism had ended, Africa was still stuck as exporter of cheap raw materials, importer of expensive goods. So in independence, you could keep African countries just the same, but you could also wash your hands from the responsibility of former colonies and just declare that, blame all the poverty and any problem that's going on, you blame it on local inept, corrupt leaders, and say that they are the responsibility for what has happened. When the responsibility really was the previous history, how it was structured, and it was purposely structured so nothing should be able to change even after independence. You make sure you keep the economies tied to and dependent on Africa, and you did this by financial controls through loans in terms of trade, and it made sure that there was no cooperation or trade between different African countries. Even up to very recently, there's much more trade, say, between Nigeria and the UK than there is between Nigeria and Togo or Ghana or any of the the nearby countries. It's like that all over Africa. But even the neo-colonial Islam had to reinvent itself because the economy has changed from a neo-colonial world. We moved very quickly to a globalized world. And what did this mean? In a neo-colonial world, we said they provide raw materials for the mother country, and they were bought the goods, and all manufactured in Western countries. But what happened in globalization is that manufacturing itself was outsourced to not only use then the cheap raw materials. Now we want to use the cheap labor in third world countries, so-called third world countries, and also by extracting raw materials and producing manufactured goods, there is a lot of pollution and environmental destruction, which you don't want in your own backyard. So you push that one to the developing world. This is called, there's someone who came up and they said the inverse Kuznets curve. The Kuznets curve was actually a theory that had to do with how inequality was supposedly become less, I say. Anyway, but the reverse curve, which is what we're talking about here, it's a stipulation that the pollution is little before industrialization. Then as you get in industrialization, pollution became very big. And then as the industrialization went even further, the pollution went down. And this is was claimed and they wrote the paper. But it has been proven that in Western countries, yes, it did happen, but it's because the pollution was not less, but pollution was exported. So all the things that are environmentally degrading, they are much more, and the European countries did benefit from it more, but it was exported, so the environmental destructions in them is in other countries. So as we see, throughout this time, from the beginning of we start with slave trade and the Industrial Revolution all the way to the globalization. What lies behind it is the motive of greed and this exploitative role of capitalism. And what is it that drives capitalism? It's the demand for profit. Whatever form of capitalism has taken, you've seen that every change that happened in the structures were motivated by that the new change was necessary to maintain the high rates of profit. In a capitalist economy, all transactions have to make a profit. Anything that is not profitable will be eradicated by market forces. And so profit is what is a driving force of capitalism. But you cannot have profit out of nothing. For profit, you need to exploit human and natural resources. And the exploitation of human resources drives inequality. And the exploitation of natural resources, which is in a sense even worse than human resources, it goes to destruction of the world, the natural world. Why do I say that it's worse? Because human resources, yes, it's terrible for the people it happens, but you can, anytime you like, change. If you can make a revolution, or you can reverse it, and so on. You can actually start to treat people better. But if we destroy enough of the natural world, there will be nothing left to go back to. And this is what is happening. Let's think of it like this. as long as I exploit the planet at the rate or below a rate of the planet can regenerate itself, it's like the bucket on the left. The water that is going out is the same amount as the water coming in. But if we start to take out more from the world, the planet, then the planet can actually sustain, then we are reducing the amount of natural wealth, which reduces the productive capacity of the planet, and we'll end up with a planet that is capable of supporting much less people than it is now. And if we do it too far, then the whole ecosystem will collapse. And even there's no guarantee that the ability of the ecosystem to sustain life will be maintained. The time when we globally started to take out more resources from the world than what the world can produce was in the early 1970s. Until that time, the amount of resources we were taking out was increasing, but we were still within the limit of what was sustainable, because the ecological footprint was lower than the biocapacity. But once the ecological footprint is higher than the biocapacity, we get an ecological deficit, which you see in the red shaded area. And this happens when the economy keeps on growing. George Monbiot said that almost all systems of economic thought are premised on the idea of continued economic growth, which would be fine and dandy if we lived on an infinite planet. But there's this small, niggling, inconvenient fact that the planet is, in fact, finite, and that, unlike economic theory, it is governed by physical and biological reality. So it is impossible to keep on growing the economy exponentially in infinity, because the planet doesn't grow. The growth rate of the planet is much, much more limited. If we grow the economy faster than what the planet can have, we will have a problem. Kenneth Boulding expressed it even more succinctly. He said, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. So what happens when we are taking out more than what the Earth can produce? Let's look at a simplified measure of a fish population. The green is the carrying capacity of fish, and the yellow is how much fish we take out. It is possible for a short period to take out more fish than the carrying capacity. But when you do that, then the ability of the ecosystem to support, to maintain fish collapses. And eventually the carrying capacity drops to a much lower level, which means that after the overshoot, there will be an enormous collapse in our ability to take out things from the Earth. Now, there was in the 1970s, we had the limits to growth report, which made computer simulations of what would happen. And the unfortunate thing about that one, in the 1970s, there were chances that it had many, many different simulations depending on what actions human beings should take. This is the scenario of business as usual, that nobody does anything to bother about it. And this frightening thing is that now, 40 years later, the trend is almost exactly the way it was predicted by the business as usual scenario. We have not done anything to curb pollution or limit the amount of energy we are using, or anyway trying to restrict the growth of the economy. And as we see here now, we are in 2020s. This is, you have to see the 20. Do you see if I move my cursor? Is that shown in the?
Yes.
If I point at something, do you see it or you don't see it?
Yes, we see.
Okay, so we have 2,000, 250, so 220s here. So we are actually at the time here where we're just starting to see the slowing down of the industrial output per capita, not complete, but per capita per person. Pollution, how it's going up, the services per capita. We are just according to this projection, we are just on the peak. So this is, the next years are going to be crucial to see if also the collapse is going to happen. But if it is actually true, it's been true so far, it's a frightening scenario. And with the capitalist economy, okay, and we say here that once the footprint has grown beyond the sustainable level, as it already has, it must eventually come down, either through the managed process, that means we change the way we are doing things to have less stress on the earth, or through work of nature. It means if there's no more oil to be drilled, then we will not drill any oil. Or if climate change make it impossible to grow that much food, then we want to grow it. We run out of groundwater, we will also not do it. So it will come down. The question is only how and by what means. Do we do it in a controlled way, or will nature do it for us? And then it will be severe and direct. Now, the question is now, if we want to restore then Africa's greatness, what is the path? How would we go about doing it? If we try to think that by continuing to follow the capitalist mode, we can restore Africa's greatness, we are highly fooling ourselves. If capitalism leads to the destruction of the natural world, and it will do so in Africa also. It also leads to perpetuate to inequality, and if we continue a capitalist path in Africa, it will also do the same. Inequality will grow, and natural resource and pollutions natural resources will be robbed and pollution will be destroyed. And actually, even it doesn't go for the benefit of Africans. All the destruction of pollution and the toil of Africans, it goes to feed a high living standards in other countries. And it is actually, we say this is racism, but it's not really racism, because capitalists don't care about race. It is just was a convenient thing to get what they wanted, but they play the race card. But capitalism itself is colorblind. If we now want to say Africa should stand up and follow the same development in Europe, this means that we're going to have black capitalists instead of white capitalists. But the greed that underlies the feature of capitalism is the same regardless who it is. There are good and bad people in Europe, and it's good and bad people in Africa. The problem was that it was the bad people and the greedy people, the capitalism in Europe, that controlled the development and exploited its own people and exploited the rest of the world. So if we want to provide a new sustainable way, we have to think differently. This is Kate Raworth's donut, which I find is very good in demonstrating the idea of a sustainable economy. And here, the outer boundary is the boundary for the environment, freshwater use, climate change, biodiversity loss, and these things. If we break these barriers, we'll destroy the nature, which is the source of all our wealth. But if we shrink too much and we're not producing enough, there will not be enough food, water, energy, jobs, and other things that people need to survive. So the safe space is in this part of the donut, where you keep an economy that is big enough to provide for people's needs, but not as growing just for the sake of growing. Right now, we have an economy that is addicted to growth, and it's growing whether it brings prosperity or not. It has to grow. What we need is a sustainable economy that provides the needs for people. Whether it grows or not should not be the important thing. The important thing is that we satisfy human needs. So in capitalism, the economy aimed to generate profit for entrepreneurs, but in a Prout economy, it aimed to satisfy human needs. And that is a huge difference in how we structure our society. Capitalism exploits people and planet in their process, whereas in Prout, it respects both people and planet, and it creates a sustainable, equitable society. Capitalism is based on unrestrained exponential growth, but in Prout, growth, there's nothing against growth, but it has to be kept within the limits that the planet and ecosystem can sustain. Capitalism creates environmental destruction and staggering inequality, but Prout promotes a healthy ecosystem and an equitable and just society. So if we want to restore Africa to its previous greatness as the cradle of both human existence and human civilization, we cannot do it by the approach of the capitalist approach. It will just lead to environmental degradation and inequality. What we need to follow an approach like Prout, which is creates a sustainable economy, which emphasizes providing the need of all people in an equitable way, distribute resources, use resources maximum in such a way that it sustains people and the planet, and that would be the path towards a resilient, great Africa again. Thank you. That's about one hour presentation I prepared. So time for anyone who wants. Okay. So anyone has any questions, also comments, we can take it now. Okay, someone is bringing up the difference between about Baba's writings about history. I cannot comment on it. I can just tell you what the consensus of the science as we know it now is saying about African history and the archaeological findings that we have found. I'm not Baba. I cannot. I don't. I just have. Baba tells us we should follow the intellect and rational mind, and this information is what is this current state of archaeological findings that I presented in this book. If people have another beliefs in it, of course, they are welcome to have it. Do you have a written article or book with this information? I wrote a book very long time. It's out of print. It was also, that's why I was asked to talk here. I had another topic. Then I remembered I have a book that was written, was called the Restoration of African History. It was published in Kenya in 1990. And I used some of the materials in that book. It's possible that one could republish it, but I don't think it's in print at the moment.
Hello, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Bon, j'ai un peu une question. Je ne sais pas si la sœur Bourvati est en train de me suivre pour traduire.
Sorry, I cannot hear. Was that a question?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello, Bourvati. Hello?
Yes. Anyone is trying to ask a question?
Bon, je voulais un peu poser la question par rapport à la situation de l'Afrique. Bon, avec le problème que l'Afrique est en train de traverser sur tous les plans, que ce soit sur le plan politique, économique ou social. Et de l'autre côté aussi, il y a un problème spirituel. Moi, je voulais un peu savoir.
Anyone who can translate the question? My French is not good enough.
His question is unfinished, so let me try to translate it.
Yes, please. Oh, namaskar.
Namaskar, dear, namaskar.
Nice to hear you.
So what he's telling that regarding the problems of Africa, that we see the problem in Africa in economic level and cultural level, financial level, social level, and even spiritual. So what is the question, man? Finish your question.
Yeah, the question is, quel est le moyen que l'Afrique peut utiliser pour se libérer de cette chaîne du capitalisme?
What are the means that Africa can use to free itself from this type of capitalism? So it is a broad question, actually.
I think, well, okay, I'll make a patent funny kind of reply and say that's to try to work to implement Prout. But of course, that's not a honest solution to this. But the time is to start to, it took us over an hour to discuss this, to go in a strategy for these changes. I'm coming out with another book, which I hope we publish soon, which will be, gives a little bit, at least my views on how changes to the entire capitalist system can and will be done. But I would just say like this, capitalism is so powerful and entrenched over the world. So if we say that if there was a possibility for it to continue, then it's probably there's no power that's strong enough to destroy it. But the fact is that it is now going up against something that is more powerful than it, and that is nature itself. It's bringing in going into the limits of the pushing the limits of what nature can manage. And that means that the constant growth that it is dependent on for its survival is no longer going to be sustainable. And when that happens, people will have to reassess the way we're doing things, and it will be a big changes coming. And the question is, the sooner we start to consciously act to make these changes, the better and less painful the transition will be. But if we just wait for the changes to happen by themselves, then it would be just total collapse. It is not a question between actually capitalism and proud. It's the difference, the choice. If you look at it in length, you talk about decades and ahead, because things are coming to a point. It's the choice between proud or another sustainable economy, or total collapse of entire society. Because if something is unsustainable, it means it will not continue, and that's what we have right now. With they're struggling every year with all kinds of tricks to keep the economy running for a little more time, but it's running out of options. I can't go into it in detail. I'm discussing it in very much detail in a new book that I'm publishing.
There is a question, one more question in Portuguese. They say from Brazil. Once Africa is the cradle of civilization, why Africa didn't give us the first spiritual master? That is a question that is asked. Why the first spiritual master didn't come from Africa since everything? So that is from Umesh from Belo Horizonte.
I don't see a logical link. It's to say, because the first person was born in a certain place, it must have the fastest runner, or because someone is that they would have the higher level of spirituality. Who decides where Tarak Brahma is reincarnating? I mean, probably he'll take his place in a place where he thinks that it will have the most impact on society. But I don't see a causal link between the two. But on the other side, what spirituality there was in Africa, we don't know, because we destroyed all the African religions and ideas. And what we are left with is basically the external superstitions and the jujus and the things like that. But if you look in deeper, I studied it one time. I forgot his name now. This is like 30 years ago or something like that. 30, 40 years ago, I was in this. But there is one book called The Arkan Doctrine of God, which is was written by someone. I forgot what his name is now. He was imprisoned by Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, and they destroyed some of the things. But the concepts there were very, very close to Baba's philosophy. If you talk about the supreme consciousness operating principles, they were about analysis about how the soul and the mind is structured. It was exceedingly subtle and rare. So I'm feeling that all these subtle and the really things that were destroyed. So I'm not saying that they were the greatest spiritual things came from Africa. I have no evidence, but I'm saying that the little hints I see is that there is a possibility that there was a much greater spiritual awareness than what we think. The same as we have destroyed the idea of the civilizations, it seemed we could possibly also have destroyed the spiritual ideas and the understanding that existed. We have, once you destroyed the whole culture and everything, there's nothing left. So we don't know what was there.
Yes, exactly. And including, as you confirmed also, I think what you said about Egypt is the same thing that was said by Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese guy who studied very much Egypt. So at some point, Egypt was led by some type of priest leadership, you know. So there is strong spirituality which was there, from where even mystical groups of Europe later on learned many things and grew up. So I believe there was, yes, as you just
We
answered.
don't know. In Egypt, we have a unique thing because of the hieroglyphs, and there is a lot of written literatures. But you see everywhere in what we see there is mostly mythology. The same thing in India. If we look at the popular level of mythology and all the gods and goddesses, then it's almost silly and crude and like that, because the deep tantric truths and so were not as visible, and people really didn't know it. And so there's just because that we hear about gods and goddesses and things like that and read about them, doesn't mean that there was not a deeper understanding of people who are initiated into it and had a much deeper realization. But that's why I was mentioning this work of the Alkan Doctrine of God, where it was actually like a very deep tantric text that it was explaining it. And it was most likely in Egypt also, there was a deeper understandings of religion than what we could maybe take from the superficial level, just like in India.
Yes. Onkarnat made a statement that Africa has to recover its authentic spirituality. He just wrote this. Yeah.
Yes. And someone asked, do matrilinear society tend to respect nature more? I would say that most what do you say? Let's say now, okay, what is the highest level of spirituality? What we are, the worst thing you can call about what you can, when you accuse someone in their view, is that they are animists. Okay, that's like the lowest religion, when you see spirits in everything like that. But if we draw the conclusions of it, you have Descartes, who introduced who is supposed to be one of the great philosophical leaders of Western society, who was totally intellectual. So he claimed that only the human beings, man had a soul, and all the animals were soulless. And to prove it, the point, he took his wife's live dog and nailed it on the board and dissected it while it was alive. And when he was screaming and hurt, he says, these are just automatic reactions. He doesn't feel anything. He doesn't feel pain because he doesn't have a soul, so he cannot do that.
Wow.
And the same, and this has been the leading force of European thinking since then. We disregard nature, we hurt and we eat animals, we destroy them, and we've gone even further. We're destroying the whole ecosystems that we depend on for our survival. It is not that nature is a resource for us to benefit and exploit. We are part of nature. If nature gone, we are gone also. Now, so this is our highly intelligent and sophisticated culture that get this result. But if you look at the animists, who are so primitive and stupid and like that, they feel that everything is interconnected. I cannot do anything here because it will hurt other parts of the creation. Now, this is very close to the latest realization in ecological science, that everything is interconnected and so on. If you look at the result of following an animist viewpoint, is that you treat everything with respect. If you kill an animal, you talk to him and give apologize that you have to take its life. You make sure that the forests and everything are maintained and like that. It was a highly ecological outlook. So if you say it's primitive, but if the result is that we are protecting the world in such a way that it can promote a sustainable society for generations to come, how can we say that it's primitive? It is actually much more sophisticated than all our intellectual things, because no matter how intellectually smart they are, if they result in that we are committing suicide, collective suicide, by destroying the very nature that we depend on our survival, it does not is not an indication of us being being so much superior to the people who are actually doing the things that are the sensible thing to survive. So I think it's not just a maternal, it looks like both paternal and maternal, patriarchal and matriarchal societies in the past, they were much more knowledgeable and more sensible when it comes to ecological awareness. Okay, now there's a question about the pyramids visible all on Earth. Yeah, there's a whole history about that. Also, that I have studied it, but I'm not an expert on it. I don't like to talk about things that I really don't study, but I'm very sympathetic with ideas that shows that there had been great civilizations before this recent burst of civilization that might be before 12,000 years ago, which when we start to see history. But it's still, if we look at the long term, we are talking about hundreds of, this is just in the recent, whether it's 12,000 or 30,000 years like that. But what we were looking at the prehistory here, we were talking about hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years and so forth. I don't think it changes the general outline of what we know in any case. But it's true, even in South America, it's interesting, the greatest pyramid we found is in South America, not in in Egypt. So there's a lot of interest in this. And there is an interesting thing, if you look at the latest aerial mapping of the Amazon rainforest where the Aztecs lived, it shows that we only see the forest, but it looks like they actually were huge cities that covered enormous areas of it with roads and so that were kilometers after kilometers of developed things that existed earlier, which is now lost. And we thought that were just very small little civilization, but it seemed to have been very great. So it's not only Africa, it's many other places where civilization seems to have lost and been abandoned.
Yes.
Okay, I think that our 1.5 hours is up. Is there any last question and comment no one will have? Otherwise, I guess close it here.
On the chat, there is no more questions. Maybe a comment that the class was fantastic. Great research with names and references. was fantastic. Thank you.
If anyone wants, I have the, I just was very, this is just the popular, but if anyone wants greater sources and names and where to study, if you want to African history, Basil Davidson is a good place to start. Actually, he's one of the few Western historians that actually, and about the slave trade, he has a book called African Mother. And anyway, he's written a lot of. Basil Davidson would be a good way to start to learn more about this. Stanley Sagange, which I also quoted, if you can find the book, because he's from Zimbabwe, African Saga would be a good book. He also wrote some fiction, which but very relevant. On Trial for My Country is a very interesting and one maybe his most famous book, but I don't know how far they are imprinted. Okay. But Basil Davidson, definitely they will be in print. You can probably even get it on Amazon. Okay, thank you very much then, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.